Hello everyone, welcome to day 3 of the Django Bootcamp. We're going to try and cover this overview fairly quickly so we can jump into the code much quicker as well. And then stick around for Q&A. It's live Q&A. I try to answer your questions, but most of them are only going to be questions I'll answer that are relevant to what we're talking about in the Django Bootcamp. So if you want more in-depth questions that aren't in the Django Bootcamp, make sure you come on one of my live Q&A sessions at another time. So just a quick recap. We talked about this as a URL. This is what's important to Django, at least in how it parses out this URL, how it actually handles this URL. This is what we did last time. We talked about path, query, and query parameters. We actually didn't show you how to use query parameters yet. That is something we'll do in the future, but those pieces are the main of importance for us when it comes to Django. And that was illustrated by something like this, right? So what happens is we get our Django URLs coming in, or a request coming in rather, that's parsed by the Django URLs or urls.py. And you can have a lot of these different files, as I've mentioned, but more specifically, we had one primary URLs file. And then that actually, moved our content or our request around to a different view. So the view actually handled every single URL. The URL itself could just be dynamic. You could use those regular expressions. You could use just a built-in path argument parsing feature, or you could just not have any arguments to it whatsoever. It doesn't have to be a dynamic URL, as you might imagine. And of course, in the views, that's where we actually can interact with the Django models. Again, this is an optional feature that's built into Django if you need it. And we actually did render out some content to HTML. We actually rendered out JSON data, and we also rendered out poorly structured HTML data. And that's actually what we want to talk about here, is we want to dynamically render HTML data. So before we actually get into that portion, let's take a look at how to do, well, something fairly basic in Python, and that is string substitution. So what we've got here are a few different options for string substitution that you might be well aware of. But the concept of templates inside of Django is just like this. We're going to be creating templates that we use substitution for with the context we want to give it, right? So if you look at sub2, the variable sub2, it's actually passing in context of a keyword argument named and the variable of name. That's actually a lot closer of how these templates are going to work for us. Not necessarily f-string substitution or even the %sign substitution. So we did this, right? This was an f-string substitution. This does work. Like, technically speaking, it works. And you might be thinking to yourself, technically speaking, I can probably open a file that has a string in it and do sub2 and actually replace things there. And technically speaking, it would totally work. But that's not best practice. So what we actually want to do is use Django templates to do this, right? So this is going to make our views and the things that we render being a lot more effective. And that's what we're going to be discussing in this one. So if you remember back to when you first create any sort of Django project, and more specifically when you create a Django app in that project, you get something called views.py. And in there, this is the default line, which is django.shortcuts import render. And this is the one we actually want to go back to using because it's incredibly easy to render out HTML using this method. Not the only way to do it, but it's definitely an easy way to do it. And that's the way we'll use, because this is what you'll see on a lot of projects anyway. So that's going to mean that we won't actually need to use at least the HTTP response import for this in particular. So without further ado, let's code. Hopefully that was an easy enough overview of just generally what we're trying to solve here. I think the biggest thing is we're actually going to solve it in the code, right? So that's actually what we want to be doing, not really spend a whole lot of time of, in theory, how it works. So let's jump into our code. And I'm going to go into, first and foremost, I'm going to go into our settings.py module. And I'm going to point you to a couple things that maybe you forgot about or not fully aware of. The root URL configuration. This, of course, has everything to do with how we're going to render out our URLs, like right here. right? So whatever the root one is, that is where Django is going to look by default. And of course, it's going to give us a module name. So that's bootcamp here, and then urls.py. That is actually how that part works. And then you go down a little bit further and we see templates here. So templates is really cool because it has a lot of different options for us by default. But what I want to do is actually make it really simple for everybody. And I'm going to make one folder inside of my bootcamp for templates. And I'm going to call it literally templates. Right? This is actually very common in Django projects, is to call it templates. And I want to actually let Django know I'm going to be storing data in here. So in this, I'll just go ahead and say home.html. And inside of home, I'm still going to use poorly formatted HTML and just say hello world, exclamation mark. Okay. So now I have an HTML document that I actually want a view to render. So before the view can actually render it, Django needs to know where this HTML document is, or more specifically, where generally to look for this HTML document. And we do that inside of settings in this dirs right here, or the directories where our templates probably live. Now, in this case, I'm going to be using something called base dir and then doing /templates. So this is using the path lib option. And if you use different versions of Django, you might be using the OS path option. So if it is the OS path, it's just os path.join base dir and templates. Not a whole lot different, but it is absolutely, well, it is different, but it's not a whole lot different, right? So if you don't know pathlib, this is basically just saying, hey, take this path, add a slash to it. It's not trying to divide or anything like that. And then add the templates there. And this is also cross-platform, which is really nice. So you definitely want to use it in this format if you're on Windows as well. So cool. Now that Django knows about this settings file, well, let's actually see if it works. So going into our views.py here, we've got our home view here. And if you remember, this is actually on the search path right now. This is actually just to illustrate a concept. We're probably not actually going to use this view in the future, but for now, let's go ahead and keep it there. And I'll go ahead and comment out my original HTTP response. This one does say hello world with an H1 as well. So let's go ahead and say hello, welcome home instead on the home.html. That way we know for sure that it's not the original. So we're going to go ahead and return render. And what render takes in is 3 arguments, or 3 potential arguments, but definitely 2. The first one is the actual request, which we don't have the request coming in here. The second one is the template that we want to use. In my case, it's home.html. And the final one is any additional context we want to pass in to home.html. We'll talk about that a lot once we get into the product detail itself. Now, if you remember back, the view itself inside of args, or in a positional argument, is request. And it's always going to be the first argument. No matter what it is, it will certainly be that first argument. So there we go. We now can actually render out this home.html page. So what I need to do is actually run the server. Now, I don't have my virtual environment activated. I don't have my server running. So I'm going to go ahead and turn those things on with source bin/activate, and then Python manage.py run server. Right. And we'll go ahead and open this up. And again, if you remember back, the path that we want to find here is on search. Okay. And hey, what do you know? It says, hello, welcome home. So it's actually rendering out this data. Cool. So going back to what we talked about in the earlier, oops, that's not the right one. Let's go back here. Right here, the string substitution thing. How do we accomplish something very similar to this with home.html and the view? Well, that's from this context right here. So if I say context and I pass in a dictionary of some kind, oops, didn't mean to do that. Sorry about that. If I pass in this context here and say, well, let's say name, very similar to like what we did in that slideshow. And I'll say Justin. I can pass in this context dictionary to this render function. Right, so when I pass in this context dictionary, that actually gives me the ability to render that data out. Now, in the string formatting portion, you would use a single curly braces and say something like name. But in Django templates, you actually use 2 curly braces, right? So you use these braces to actually render out any of the content that you're passing through here. So we save that, and I can go ahead and refresh. And what do you know? Hello, welcome home, Justin, right? So now I can actually do that, and that also means that I can change it on the fly, which of course, if you're like, whoa, wait a minute. And here we also did something very similar to that with the URL. We had a dynamic URL with this primary key or ID. That dynamic URL gave me a different value from the database, right? So how do we actually apply that same concept inside of this detail view? Don't worry, we will definitely get there, but I think you actually already know enough to accomplish that right now. But we want to get best practices going, and we definitely want to improve this home.html, and we actually want to add additional features into home.html that just aren't currently there, right? So here's one of those features. This is not valid HTML content at all. So what we want to do is have valid HTML content. So to do this, we're going to go ahead and say base.html. Now, if you're not incredibly familiar with HTML itself, browsers are really good these days where if you don't have valid HTML, browsers will often fix it for you in real time, because there's a lot of beginners out there that use HTML and use it poorly. So luckily, all of the modern browsers know this really well because HTML has been out forever. So these modern browsers figured out, hey, let's fix this HTML. So before I even look at this base.html, we can actually render out the HTML that's here inside of the view that we have. So if we go to view developer and view source, this will show you the HTML that's rendered out, right? So yes, it only says H1. It's not full featured HTML, but it's still actually treating it as it is. Another way to look at this is if we inspect any of these elements here, what's actually being rendered, not what's coming from the source, but what's actually being rendered is inside of this element here. Notice that it says HTML, it has a head tag, it has a body tag, it has all of the valid markup or the valid HTML that you would really want to have. But I actually didn't write that in my source at all. The browser did that for me. This is a nice thing to have, but it's not good to do this, right? It's better to actually give the browser the correct HTML. And luckily, Django has a way to do that really easily, and it's called template inheritance, where you have a parent HTML document and children that inherit from that parent HTML document. So let's take a look at this. So first and foremost, let's actually create valid HTML. First off, declaring that is a doc type HTML, then creating an HTML tag. You also might have a head tag here, and then you would have a body tag as well. So in the head tag, you might do something like title. You might have your HTML or additional HTML in there, such as CSS. But I'm going to just go ahead and say Django Bootcamp for our title here. And now I'm actually going to use something built into Django, which is incredibly nice, and that's saying block content. Now notice that I used a brace and then a %sign, so the curly bracket and a %sign, and then I wrote out block. Block itself is what is used in Django. Content is just best practices. This is a variable, so you can absolutely change it. And then we've got % curly brackets. Now, in a lot of programming, you might be like, okay, well, I'm done. But since we're using HTML, I believe that Django made templates to work very similar to HTML, and specifically these kind of template tags. So that means that if you ever open a tag, you must close that tag, and you can say it like that. So very similar to HTML tags, you have to open and close them, right? So Django template tags, you also have to open and close in general. Now this is a very simple one, which we'll show you in just a second as to what it does, but it's a very simple one that you'll probably use a lot of. So another way to think about this is to have a block for your JavaScript, or have a block for additional title tags you want to have. Right? You can actually put these things everywhere, and how they actually render is going to be based off of the template that is inheriting from this template. In other words, the template that's using this template inside of itself. So to do that, we go into home.html, and now we're actually going to inherit from, so we'll do extends base.html. home.html. So this is saying, hey, Django, make sure that you're using base.html as well in home.html. So now if we save this and refresh our home.html, things went away. But something that should stand out is we now have a title here. That title is from base.html, not from home.html. So how do we actually get this content in here? Well, it's using one of these blocks here. So these blocks are really great for substituting content into the parent HTML document here. So I can actually pass that through. We save it. Now it's being rendered in two places. So we've got that title tag here as well as all this data. So we could go a little bit further in here and actually add in a style tag, an inline style tag, and just go ahead and say H1 and color is, I don't know, red, right? You're probably not going to want to do this long term, but if we change the H1 in the base document, it changes it in the home.html document as well. Okay, so let me just recap everything that's happening here. So let's go ahead and back up to that keynote, and we see, or the slideshow presentation. So what we see here is string substitution, right? So we want to extrapolate this idea of string substitution into our HTML document. But we also want to use other HTML documents to make our string substitution more robust. Now we can absolutely use this formatting method to substitute different bits and pieces of, some sort of Python string or a Python managed string, but we want to do it a little bit more effectively. So Django gave us this really cool option to use actual HTML files. So the actual HTML file, which allows our code editor to actually validate HTML. So I can actually write proper HTML. If you noticed while I was typing out style or any of these tags, it was giving me the options to use proper HTML. So now that we understand that, these HTML documents can be used, then Django decided, or the Django developers decided it'd be really nice to be able to just substitute little blocks anywhere inside of our content. So we can actually bring in more dynamic content in there and not repeat ourselves over and over and over again, right? So like all of this data in here, and you might imagine it can get a lot more complicated than this, even on the base HTML document. We don't want to have to repeat that over and over again. We just want to have the little tiny little section that's important for that particular view, right? In this case, it's not a whole lot, but it can get to be a whole lot, and we can have a lot of arbitrary things that are coming in here as well. So that is actually, I think, pretty cool. And if it's confusing at all, just remember that the more you use it, the better you'll get at something like this. And there's also a lot of documentation on these block tags or these block template tags that Django has as well. So to get better at this, let's actually look at another view that we will actually be using, which is our product detail view. Okay, so our product detail view has a lot more content in it than just the object.id. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this out. And now what I'm going to do is return render of the request again, and then the template that I want to use. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and say products/detail.html. And then I'm going to go ahead and pass in my context. In this case, I'll just use object as the key. And then obj is the actual instance that I want to pass into this string substitution. So one of the red flags might be going off, or one of your ding ding ding, what's going on here is going off. Right here, notice that I'm actually passing a full-on object into the template itself. That's really, really cool. We'll see this in a second. So now let's jump back into Chrome and let's take a look at this product. So if I go to products 2 or 1, template does not exist error. Now this is actually expected to be seen because I never actually created a template called products/detail.html. We just totally skipped over that so you could see this error, because you'll definitely see this error. Because, sometimes you write things incorrectly. Maybe you already have seen this error. So I want to actually point out a couple things to you. We've got the very first one is the file system loader. And then we've got the app directories loader. or well, two versions of the app directories loader here. And it's telling me that this file does not exist. So this Django file system loader is actually what we set up just a little bit ago. As you can tell, it's a path that goes directly to that templates directory that I created, and it goes into products and then detail.html. The next one is it's actually looking in my app directories, and it's actually looking in two different apps themselves. The first one is the admin app, so django.contrib.admin. The second one is django.contrib.auth. So two different Django applications that are built by default. It's actually looking for that template in there, which is pretty cool because you can actually look up these templates that the Django admin has, right? So you can actually see those on GitHub if you want to take a look at what they do with templates, because it's definitely more advanced than what we cover here. So you probably learn a lot there. But the key thing to note of how this is looking for templates is number one, is looking where we told it to look. And then number two, it's looking in a default that it already has built in. So we actually could have completely skipped building our own template directory and letting Django know about it. Like we could have skipped this entire part and really just jumped into our installed application, all of our installed apps, and created a folder in there. So if I come into products, I can make a new folder in here called templates. And then inside of here, I can make another folder called products. And then inside of there, that is actually where I'll put detail.html. Hit enter. And again, I'll go ahead and do extends base.html because I want to use everything that's in that HTML document or that base.html document. And then I'll go ahead and replace block content and in block content. You're like, hey, wait a minute, where did in block content come from? This is just a more explicit way to end it. You can use it with or without it. So now I can go ahead and say, hi there, and then using object.id. Now, of course, it's object because in our view, we pass that as our keyword argument or the key value pair that's going into that context itself. And it's rendering out the products detail. That's how I knew how to name this folder products and this file detail. Templates has to be named templates, whereas on our main project, it does not have to be named templates. It's fairly arbitrary on how you name it, but it's best practice to name it templates. Inside of the app itself, it has to be named templates. So now we save that and we refresh in here. And what do you know? It now says hi there too. So this is actually looking in the app directory. So now we know two different ways on how we can actually store our data. So one of the other cool things here is I can actually come into my file systems directory and I can make a new folder in here called products and a new file in here called detail.html and just say h1 hello there. Save that, refresh in here. Now it's not inheriting from anything. It's not using that base.html. It's literally just using this document, detail.html. So what this actually should tell you is, well, maybe you're even more confused now, but now what we know is this, whatever we set here, is going to be what it uses by default. So it's actually going to look in that directory first. Once it finds a match for the template that we're trying to render, it's going to render that one. So this is really cool because that also allows us to override templates from other third-party packages or even the Django admin itself. I'm not going to be covering those things in particular. It starts to get a lot more advanced there, but it is important to note that inside of the product app or any sort of Django app, you can have the templates in there as long as they are inside of the installed apps and you can render out those templates. Okay, so I'm actually going to bring this back in to the other one and I'll just work off of this other one now. And let's just go ahead and write a little note out of the block content, say this template is not used. Look in the main templates directory. Okay. So now we've got this object ID. Well, what else can we grab from this object? Well, we've got, I'm actually going blank on what all of the fields that I have currently. I've got title, content, and price. So inside of detail, and get rid of these things and do h1 and object.title, and then h1 and p object.content. Cool. So we refresh in there. Hey, what do you know? We've got some content on both of these. Wait a minute. Raspberry Pi, that first one, does not have any content. So here is another potential of some sort of condition that you'll use inside of templates. So we already know, hopefully by now, that there are conditional statements that you can have. So like if obj.content equals to none, we can actually return a different template if we want. Like, hey, this product's coming soon, or whatever, right? You can totally do something like that. That actually is not how I want to handle this kind of logic. What I actually want to handle this kind of logic is inside of the detail.html. So this instance in particular is, well, it's a little complicated and you can do all sorts of cool things here, but I really just want to illustrate a point with the template itself. So you can actually have if statements in here. So we can say if object.content, just like we did with the block, we use an if instead of block. And just like we did with the block, we have to close it off. So curly brackets, %, end if, and there we go. So now if there is content, it will render something out. We can also use an else in here and say, you know, p content coming soon. All right, pretty cool. So I often like to tab these things in here just to make it a little bit more clear as to the condition statements or the condition blocks. That's not something you need to do per se, but it is a nice thing to have. So there is another thing that I do want to talk about, but this is essentially the gist of Django templates. So we look at our views, we first off declare where we want the template to live, and there are some built-in defaults and some best practices here. But in my case, I'm trying to follow the app name itself. So the app name is products. And then I'm using detail.html because I'm using a detail view. That's roughly what I'm doing. Now, sometimes what you'll see is going one step further and including something like the actual model itself. So the model name itself, which is product, right? Then you'll see often something like this, where it's product_detail.html with all that context. I don't need to do that because I only have one model in my models.py, but it is food for thought, something you should consider while you're building these things out. But all the while, don't spend too much time thinking about it, just like I did not. Okay, so what we did was we declared the template string where it's going to live. And it can live in two places. It can live inside the app itself or in the templates directory we created with that folder we need to create for it. Then we can pass in any context that we want here. You can pass in a random number. You can pass in a range of numbers. You can pass in a user object, something we haven't talked about yet. You can do all sorts of really, really cool things here, which is really nice, right? So this render method takes in that request and combines it with the template and the context that's coming through with that template. So then that also means that in my template, what I can also see is the request itself. So if we do request.path and save that, we actually can see what path that we're in. So this request.path comes in by default to this HTML content. I did not actually add it in as context here. Now, if you're not aware, you can do that same exact command here. So you can say print request.path. So it's quite literally the exact same object that we're using is in this request here. And if you want to learn more of that, the documentation is great, but you can also use dir to see all of the different methods that request has on it, which is probably a good thing to play around with on your own. But the reason we actually see that has something to do with another concept that Django has in by default, which is context processors. So context processors add additional context into our templates that we don't necessarily declare ourselves. right? So we didn't declare the context for request path. The only context we declared was the single object itself, right? But in our template, we can use all of this other context because of these context processors. So this right here is the request one. If I comment that out and I try to look at this now and refresh, nothing shows up. Not a huge surprise probably, but it is something that is really cool to know that it exists. So to get a little bit more advanced, you can absolutely use your own context processor if all of your templates need something that's unique to your project. Now, I will say request that user, you might be like, oh, I want to have that user everywhere. Request that user is how that's done. We just haven't covered it yet. But request that path is, I think, pretty useful because you can also have this conditional statement as well, which means, this is the cool part, which means that we can actually reuse this detail.html anywhere. It doesn't have to just be on this one single view. You can reuse it over and over again if you just want to render out one single object. That actually might be something we end up doing. Hint, hint. So I will say that the cool thing about request.path is we would say something like if request.path equals to the home page or the index page, we can say, you know, welcome home. Otherwise, we can render out another if statement like we did here, right? So I can say h3, welcome, buddy. Now, of course, that's not actually going to render out. And let's get rid of that part. The welcome buddy is not going to render out. So if we just said not equals to that, we can also do that, right? So it is really cool that we can have some sort of logic going on here. Now, if you start to write a ton of logic in here, like too much logic in here, then you're going to have some problems. And you should probably actually go back into the view itself to handle that different logic. So there's a couple more concepts we want to talk about really fast with these templates. One of them is actually including other items in our template. So let's go ahead and say navbar.html. Now, this is an arbitrary name for this, and it's not going to be a very good navbar. I'm just going to use an H1 here, and I'm going to call this Django Bootcamp. Okay, so I actually want to use this navbar in a lot of places. Let's say, for instance, I only want to use it in detail.html. I can actually include it here by using the include tab, or tag rather, and call it navbar.html. What that's going to do is actually bring in that HTML document, and what do you know? It's now bringing that in. Of course, with a navigation bar, a true navigation bar, you would probably put it in your base document here and use it just like that, right? And so now every single page would have that nav bar. This is a really bad nav bar, so it's not a great example of that. What it would be a great example is this right here. So let's go ahead and inside of products and say the actual rendered detail of some kind. So I'm actually going to call this the detail snippet.html. Snippet is often what you'll refer to as with including sub things in here. So what I'm going to do is actually cut out this right here, bring it into this snippet. And so now we've got this other HTML data here. And inside of this, I can go ahead and say include products detail underscore snippet.html. And we can add something called with, which allows us to include any of our keyword arguments here. So yeah, this is starting to get a lot more complicated, hopefully. And I say hopefully because that means you're learning a lot. If it's complicated and you're struggling a little bit, that means you're getting a lot down, even if you're not fully making sense of this, which is why you can watch it later and really play with it as well later. But anyways, so we've got the snippet here. What this is doing is saying, hey, include this document here and essentially render out our arbitrary keyword arguments here. Let's go ahead and just say the product equals to that object. I'm going to call it product instead of object as to not confuse things too much. But in the long run, you would actually want to call it object. And then in here, this detail snippet, I'll now say if product.content, because I changed what that variable was that's going in there. We can save that and we refresh in here. It still says current content is coming soon, right? Because of, probably because of how we have certain things rendered. Or actually, no, specifically because product.content for this one doesn't have any. If you go to the next one, it is now rendering out that content. like we sort of set out to do. Okay, so that is really covering pretty much all of the things you'll need in templates, with one huge exception. So let's go a little bit further and actually make list.html, where we can actually list out all of our content. So this is going to take everything we know so far and something that we do not know yet. So the first thing that I will do here is I'm going to go ahead and extend. So we'll go ahead and extends base.html, because I want to inherit from the HTML document, and I want to replace inside of block.content or block content to end block here. And now what I want to do is run a for loop. So for, let's go ahead and say object in object list. These are conventional ways of writing this. And then in for. So yes, this is a for loop. And with this, I can include that product snippet if I'd like. Let's actually do that. I'm going to make a div class here, and we'll go ahead and say object.title. And then we'll also go ahead and say include the products/detail snippet.html with product equaling to object. Okay. So that is roughly how we'd render that out, but how do we actually create an object list, and how do we render a list.html? Well, going back into our views, before I actually do this, I want to mention this is how I often work. I'm trying to show you actually how I work in real time. Well, not quite real time. I'm actually slowing it down quite a bit because I'm explaining everything. But usually what I'm doing is I'm not like, okay, well, what do I need? Let me create a view first, and then I'll do the template, and then I'll do the context. No, oftentimes what I'll do is I'll be building out a template and be like, oh yeah, it'd be really nice if I could list all of the products. So let me just finish the template first real fast, and then I'll go backwards to the view based on all the things I needed in that template. So I actually go back and forth all the time. I do this switching pattern, and what that allows me to do is, well, not really stick to like one method for writing all of this code. And I think that's an actually important thing that you want to get practice of. But if you're not really that comfortable with it, by all means, start with the view first, start with all the context you want to have first, and then go to the template and also add in all of the things you want to do, right? I just wanted to mention that because, you know, every once in a while you might get stuck and be like, hey, he did it this way, maybe I should be doing it this way. No, you need to find the way that really works for you. Just follow sort of the best practices that I'm mentioning in how you do all of this. Anyway, so let's go ahead and create a view here. So we're going to define product list view. This is going to take in a request. And like I said before, with views, we can add in keyword args and args in here. And all I need to do is return the render request and products list.html, and then some sort of context dictionary here. The context dictionary itself, well, oops, I didn't mean to open that. Sorry about that one. The context dictionary itself here, let me give us some more room. This right here needs to have the key of object list. The reason it's the key of object list is because I wrote that here. It's also very standard Django convention. So what is an object list, and how do I actually add this in here? Well, I did mention this before a little bit when we were talking about models, but there's something called a query set. So if we do product.objects.all, this is called a query set, which is essentially a list of each individual instance of this model. So this query set we can actually pass in to our context as well. No surprise there. So again, remember, it's a list. So it's an item 1, so obj1, obj2, obj3, and so on. So that means that we can iterate through it, right? So that's pretty important when it comes to the actual template itself. It is iterable, so we can actually run through it just like this. And since that every single item in there is an instance of the product model itself, I know for sure that something like this is going to work, or at least I hope that it's going to work. So let's go ahead and finally that we've got our product list view here, let's actually bring that into our URLs and display it. Right, so back into our URLs, product.views, I'm going to go ahead and import my product list view here. We'll save that. I'm going to add another new path here, and we'll call this just products. I'll get rid of the integer part, and we'll go ahead and bring in product list view as the view itself, the function, the view function, all of those good things here. And now we're going to go ahead and look at products. And there you go. So we actually have two separate products in here. Notice that our template tag is still rendering, or the actual title tag is still rendering from that base template, which is really, really nice. So maybe I want to add an additional thing there. So this is pretty much the last concept, but we now we're able to really put together the whole thing, right? So from the actual model to the view, to the context in the view, to rendering out the template. The last piece of this is one other aspect that templates have that can be dynamic. Again, having these block contents, we do have this block title here, but what I can actually do is wrap this block title around a default of some kind. And then in my list view, I can come back in here and say block title, and in block, and go ahead and just say products. So not surprising, when we refresh in here, it does say products there. But if I actually wanted to have what that original default was, as in the Django Bootcamp, and this is true for any original default, I'm just showing you the basic one for this title, we can actually use block.super. This is another built-in feature to the templates themselves, so you can actually render out what was originally there, right? So Django Bootcamp was originally there, and so now we can actually use this pretty much anywhere we need to. Now, when in doubt, I mean, if you forget about that, no big deal, because, you know, I do as well. And any of these blocks, you can still use those conditional statements as well. But it is really nice that you can call block.super when in doubt to bring in something like an individual product itself, right? So something like that. Cool. So that is Django templates. I realized we covered a lot, and I went incredibly fast for a lot of you. But the gist of this is that, technically speaking, we can use string substitution. And technically speaking, we can use more complicated string substitution. Absolutely, because Python is Python. Python will work inside of Django all the time. So with that, that means that our views themselves can continue along the lines of something like this, or what we had before with the f-string substitution. You can also use open to open a file and, you know, render out the content in that file and then have an HTTP response. But one of the biggest advantages of using Django is all of the batteries included stuff, which in this case was just that render method alone saved us a bunch of time, because even if all it did was render out this context, it'd still be incredibly valuable, that context into that template. But it goes a little bit further than that and gives us something really cool with these context processors, and we can make our own context processors, certainly a little bit more advanced, but it is a nice thing to know that it is possible to make that happen. Now, one thing I didn't mention is you can actually use different kinds of templates as well. You can use the Jinja templates that Flask uses. You can use those in here also. So Jinja is a viable option, and, you know, if you're really advanced, you can make your own templates as well. But the nice thing is Django has all this stuff in here by default. So you don't have to add additional things, and it also gives us default configuration, again, so you don't have to add a bunch of different things and all of this additional work. Okay, guys, so that is it for the code portion of this. What I'm going to be doing now is I'm actually going to be taking any and all of your questions. So let me know what those things are as I load up your questions here. I'm just going to load them up. Give me one quick second here. So hopefully you guys got a lot out of that one. I think Django templates are really, really compelling. And so when you're starting out, using these templates can speed up your development process a lot. The views and models, of course, are critical. And I think actually in the long term, you'll be using views and models a lot more than you'll use templates. But the templates are really nice because they just help so much with development and making really cool looking applications really quickly. Now, of course, it's not like an HTML. It's not a template like if you were going to buy an HTML CSS template. Of course, it's not that. It's just templates for content being rendered. So yeah, cool. And let's go ahead and take a look at this question here. What is middleware? This is a good question. So we will talk about it just briefly, but every time you request a web page, what is happening is there's a request that happens to a view, and then that view returns back a response. Middleware sits in between when a user requests and the view is hit, and it also sits in between when the request responds. So it's a function and options that you can do right in between those two things. It's actually really useful tool when it comes down to it, and it's a little bit more advanced than what I'll probably be covering in general in the Django Bootcamp. Because the vast majority of people won't need to customize their middleware, much like the vast majority of people won't customize their context processors in the templates until you start getting a lot more advanced. Great question, though. Thank you for that one. So can we fetch data in chunks in the case of millions of data models instead of using query sets that all method? Yeah, so this is definitely a little bit more advanced. There's something called pagination. You can use pagination for this. You can also slice it however you'd like using a query set filter. You can also use raw database queries. So you can use raw SQL to do the lookup, which might be the case that you'll need to do in the case of millions of lines of data. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question. I think once we get into full asynchronous Django, the method of actually doing these large lookups will probably become a lot cleaner in general. You probably can use a generator. I haven't actually needed to use a generator to actually generate all of that content as streaming data for everyone. That's a lot more advanced, but you probably can do it. I just don't really need to do it very often. So thank you for the question. Hey, thanks. I'm glad you enjoy my teaching approach. I really try to leave as little questions as your mind into how anything works that I'm talking about. Although I do want questions to spark. So it's a tricky balance, right? So I definitely want you to go, well, how does that work? And then you want to dive in on your own. But if you're asking how does that work and you're not able to really move forward with Django, that's a frustrating thing. And I really try my best to prevent that from happening, whether it's in one of these live ones or not, you know what I mean? Let's see here. So do we have other questions? Let me pull up the live stream stuff. Looks like I am getting other questions. Here we go. Yeah, so how do you access a dictionary item in a template? This is a good one. I want you to actually try this out. I think you're really close to it. Maybe try dot notation as well. But you should try it on your own. That is something that I probably should cover for real in the code. I'm not actually going to jump into the code right now to show you, but I think that you could probably do it. Thanks for the question there. All right, next one. Yeah, we definitely will be covering authentication. That's too important. And also, if you think about it, if somebody's buying a product, we want to make sure that they're logged into our service before they buy that product. You know, perhaps you can have guest accounts as well, but for the vast majority of customers, you might want them to actually authenticate. And that's something we definitely need to cover. So thanks for the question. Yeah, so what's the difference between middleware and context processors? So middleware is potentially can be used on every request, whether or not it's being rendered in a template. Context processors only work when they're rendered in a template. So they're template context processors is really what they are. Middleware can add additional context in a request as well, but that starts to get a bit more complex. So thanks for the question. Why shouldn't we have so much login inside templates? I think you meant logic here. So the thing is, you want to make your code as simple as possible, but not simpler, right? So adding into templates there's a good chance that you might actually not use those templates in the future. So if you put a bunch of logic in those templates, then your view is vulnerable to that template not being used anymore. So I would recommend that you put more of the logic that you need inside of the view itself. The other thing is the logic in the view can be improved, and it's probably more efficient because it's actually raw Python in there. It's not actually parsing anything that's happening inside of a template, right? So you're actually writing Python in the view, and the template you're not. So the template actually needs to be processed, which that processing time could take extra time, especially with simple logic items that you probably would want to use in the view instead. So when in doubt, put the logic in the view. That's my best advice for you. And even if you're rendering out a ton of different kinds of templates and the view has all these condition statements for all those different templates, I would much rather see that than you having a bunch of conditional or logical statements inside of the template itself. Because again, Python will be more efficient than rendering the template itself. And also when you send it over to a developer, maybe they're really good with Python, but not great with Django templates. So if that's the case, then you can literally just have them clean up a lot of your queries. Or if your database lookups aren't that efficient, then maybe somebody else can do that. And just sending them a view is going to be a lot easier than that. NRG Code, hey, what's up? Welcome back. Yeah, in list.html, why do we use product equals to object? Yeah, so this was meant to not confuse you with object, object, object everywhere. This is actually something I will definitely show you. Give me 1 second. Okay, so looking in our list.html, right here, this snippet here. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm passing additional context in here. So that additional context, this is the keyword and this is the value. So this is the key value pair. You absolutely can and probably should use object equals to object, but as to make sure that in the future, if you ever need to review this, you know that this is actually a variable, that variable is then used inside of here, right? So this should be object. It definitely should. That would be best practice. But for learning purposes, I'm violating best practice to make sure that it's not extra confusing, even though perhaps what I just showed you makes it more confusing. But anyways, thanks for the question. That's a really good question, Sager. Hamid, thank you so much. Appreciate it. That's very nice of you to say. Hands down the best. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate what you guys are saying. So when do you have to use a function-based view instead of a class-based view? This is a cool question and something that I'll also maybe touch on. I probably will make a standalone video talking about these things after the bootcamp ends, because class-based views adds a layer of complexity that's not necessary to really get the core of what Django is. But let me just briefly mention what class-based views do. So if we go into products and views, this right here is a detail view, right? This is actually incredibly common with models inside of Django. And since it's common, we don't want to repeat ourselves over and over and over again. What a class-based view does is take this commonality and allows you to just shortcut it by using a class instead of a function. Instead of you having to write out all of these things, you now know that this is a common thing that happens. That's also true for list views. So class-based views, you essentially just tell it what query set you want to use for both detail and list views. And that's pretty much it. And then it'll actually render out a template for you. It'll look for a specific kind of template. You can change that name. But it's just a really clean way to shortcut these generic lookups, right? So when I say generic lookups, means that this happens all the time. These are very, very common lookups that happen in Django projects. But function-based views, I think, especially if you're coming from Python and you aren't that familiar with classes and how they work, this is just so clean. It's really, really easy to know what's going on here because there's no shortcuts. There's no like assumptions that are happening. Maybe the only assumption is this render method here. You don't maybe fully understand everything that's going on with it, but you do understand with all the code that's going into that render method. Class-based views, here, I'll just tell you, class-based views look like this. So class, product, detail view, and I'll just go ahead and leave that empty for now. And you would say something like this: product.objects.all. That's your class-based view, right? So yeah, it would inherit from something called a detail view, but you know, it doesn't give you everything. It's not telling you, oh, what's this object? How's it looking it up? It's not telling you how to handle it when a product doesn't exist. It's not telling you what template it is. It's not telling you what the context is. It's not telling you a lot of things. That is one of the cool things about class-based views, is because once you get more advanced, something like this is like a no-brainer. And you can, of course, customize those things, but the function-based views don't need customization by default. Class-based views often do. Really, really good question. And when do you use them? It's really up to you. Once you get really good, then you'll start using class-based views a lot. That's what I think. But I still use function-based views all the time, just to prototype things really, really fast. And maybe I haven't worked out all the logic super cleanly, so I just use a class or a function-based view just to get it done, and then customize a class-based view later. So if you don't know what class-based views are, or not interested in that yet, don't worry about it. It's not something that you really need to worry about for a long time, if ever, really. Because if you look at things like Flask and Fast API, they only use function-based views. There's probably a way to do class-based views that I'm just ignorant of, but they pretty much only use function-based views. So yeah, that's something to be said. Cool. Which one do you prefer, using decorators or writing conditions in views? Probably using decorators, right? So for those of you who aren't aware, decorators are like a function that wraps around another function. And you can use decorators on views to enrich whatever that view is. It's definitely a little bit more advanced than what we're talking about here. But if I'm rapidly prototyping and I don't think I'm going to be reusing whatever I need in that view, then I'll just write conditions in the view itself and not decorate myself. Decorate too much, you know what I mean? That was a lame attempt at a joke. Okay. Question, can you talk about custom filters in templates? That is outside the context of this Django Bootcamp. But you can actually create filters inside of a Django template. I didn't even talk about filters at all because, well, filters are nice, but they add a layer of complexity that your template may or may not need going back to the view. So, sorry, that's not a great answer to your question, but it's just not something I'm going to talk about now. I definitely talk about it on my website, so if you go to Django or cfe.sh and look for the Django Templates Unleash, I believe I use custom filters in there so you can learn about it. And that's older templates, but it's roughly the same thing. So thanks for the question, though. Okay. So Sager, I see that you asked me that a few times. Please keep these questions to once, you know what I mean? I appreciate it. So can't we try and get specific URLs at views itself? So can the view itself parse the URL and render? Yes, it absolutely can parse inside of the view itself using those conditional statements and request.path. That is not preferred. That is not the Django way to do it. The Django way to do it is to use urls.py. But your view itself can kind of have a wildcard URL and give different responses based off of what that URL is. Nothing wrong with that, but handling all URLs through a view, well, it's kind of like redundant information that you don't necessarily need to do. But thanks for the question here. Please mention India time. Also, you joined at 10:30 IST. I'm actually not familiar with IST. Yeah, so I actually try to put it on YouTube. YouTube, I think, does a really good job with the time zones. Tell me if I'm wrong on there. The day before I actually go on, it's on YouTube with the scheduled time. It's about, I probably release it maybe 12 hours before I actually go on. But it's going to be 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, which is GMT -7 every day, Monday through Friday for the next, week and a half. So, yeah, thanks for the question. Let's see here. Yeah, so how do you call a model method from a view? Well, you can actually do it much like I already showed you how to call or grab a object itself. So let's take a look. So in here, if you have a method on your model, like calculate, you can just do that. And there you go. And then you can also say result equals to that, assuming that that method exists and you actually have it sending it back, and then you can just pass it in as result and result, something like that. That is how you do it. I'm not sure if what you're trying to do here is necessarily efficient, but that's how you call a method in a model. I think that's a good question. That may or may not come up. Actually, it probably will when we're calculating, totals, like tax and all that stuff, which is something we're going to be doing a lot more next week than this week. This is really sort of laying the foundation for what we're trying to do with the actual project. How would you call this in order to render all total hours in the instance? Yeah, so these are datetime objects. So you need to make sure that you're using a datetime field inside of the model itself, and then doing actual date calculation. It's not something I'm going to cover right now, but you want to make sure it's using the same time zone, and then you just subtract the two. That would actually calculate that time for you. Thanks for the question. Hey, thanks for watching. Hopefully you're getting a lot out of it. And I hope that this weekend, a lot of people will absolutely be catching up, right? Taking QA, yeah, you miss them all the time. I kind of do them on a whim. I don't really schedule out the live question and answers. I've been trying to do it, 4 times a week. And I also try to do it at a time that is good for as many people as possible in the world. So that's usually around the same time I'm doing these live streams, or sometimes it's later at nighttime in Pacific Standard. But it's really hard to do live Q&A that literally covers the entire world. I don't think it's possible, right? Yeah, I don't think it's possible. But you can always rewatch them. That's why I put them on there. So, yeah. Thanks for the question. And, oh yes, so I already answered that one. Let's see here. Maybe there's a few more messages. Hey, thanks for the super chat. Appreciate it. Yes, I think I just mentioned this. Perhaps you didn't hear it, but I am going to be doing function-based views throughout the bootcamp, and most likely not switching to class-based views, because I don't want to spend too much time on any given topic. Views, like, actually literally if you rewind it just a little bit, you can already get the gist of how generic class-based views work. And perhaps I can do like an after hours or after the bootcamp, if enough people want to see it, how function-based views work against class-based views and all that. But definitely on my website right now, so cfe.sh, I absolutely talk about function-based views and class-based views in the class-based views unleashed. I think it's called that, or function-based views. I can't remember the name of it, but there's definitely one for class-based views for specifically just Django on there. Thanks for the question and the super chat. Sweet. Love those super chats. Okay, so I think that's going to be it. I will answer a couple quick questions, but I meant to stop a few minutes ago because it should be about an hour long. If you're making a website where you gave a voting button, how to make it in a way that each user gives just one vote. Yeah, much like this, I think is probably what you're asking. So what you can do is you can use something called a many-to-many field, and you just add a user to that many-to-many field. Once you do that, you can't add it multiple times, essentially. So that it sort of enforces that single user for that vote, and then you can count it up. Or you can use a list and append user IDs to that list, and then do a set on top of that list, so a Python set, and then turn that back into a list, and then boom, now you got a list of unique IDs. That's another way. Probably a little bit less efficient than doing the many-to-many field, but definitely something you could do. Can we set a custom secret key in the settings file? Yes, I actually just did a blog post item on this, specifically how to generate those secret keys. It's incredibly easy to do. So cfe.sh/blog, and just, I think it's like maybe 10 of them ago, something like that. So yeah. Okay, guys, thanks for watching the live bootcamp, day 3. Tomorrow we're going to be talking about how to actually add in data to your database from a view and a template, naturally using Django forms. So thanks again so much for watching, and look forward to seeing you guys next